In topic 3, which looks at the dilemmas that planners have to face in how we would like planning to be ideally versus what planning is realistically, each member, including myself, which is Louis, Alice, Alex and Justin, share experiences throughout our times at placement where there has been a gap between the ideal and realistic decision that planners have to face. Throughout my brief time at the City of Melbourne so far, many buildings have had heritage overlays over them to protect significant sites. Although this overlay does restrict and limit developments, there are still times where planners lose control of particular restrictions and heights on new developments due to the zoning of an area. Also, from neighbourhood character where past developments have been approved, which then sets a precedent and allows future developments to follow. This is a case that is hard for planners to argue and is currently happening on Albert Street, East Melbourne, where a new development is being proposed on a site with a heritage building. The proposed building will cause a significant loss of view for surrounding residential buildings. However, previous developments on Albert Street have been approved, setting precedent of neighbourhood character, which encourages growth, which then makes it hard for planners to ideally approve an appropriate building for the site.
Exploring the politics behind the issue that planners are faced with in regard to realistic versus ideal outcomes can be related to where the power lies within planning. McDowell 2005 explores the idea of governance beyond the state, which refers to the emergence and active encouragement by the state and all other important stakeholders to make contributions to decisions in planning. However, McDowell highlights how this is Janus faced, as ultimately the power lies within the state. An example of this I could use for my placement is the current VCAT decision that came back. Although I was not involved in this application, this particular application was discussed in depth in our meetings. This application went to VCAT as the applicant was unhappy with the council's decision to refuse a large sign that they believed did not comply with the planning scheme. However, VCAT appealed this decision and the sign is going ahead. This is a prime example of the issue planners are faced with when it comes to what they would ideally want versus what the reality is, and the Janus face of governance beyond the state, as this proves planners do not always get the outcome they are wanting as the power lies within the state.
Hi everyone. In my placement, I've been working in the private sector on greenfield developments in the suburb of Officer, near Pakenham and Cranbourne. The planning system preserved Indigenous artefacts by requiring trained professionals to dig several test holes to see if any are on the site. This is a lengthy and expensive process, with costs passed on to home buyers. Determining the correct balance between housing affordability and Indigenous rights is an example of the tragic choices discussed in the lecture. Planning theory does not provide answers to this dilemma, simply stating that Indigenous rights are important. Similar to Susan Feinstein's work, a strong conception of justice is needed to deal with this issue. Academics need to actually find general rules of good practice, rather than simply advocating to ask the local community. Consultation can be done in addition to a general framework.
Throughout my 3 or so years studying urban and regional planning, a lot of content has focused on the potential social impacts of the decisions we make as urban planners in our post-studies life, in our careers. Fast forward to my first day of placement at Kingston City Council, I thought, maybe not straight away, but eventually, that I would be making ideal decisions that, although potentially unpopular with applicants, would be for the better of the community that I serve. However, as I quickly learned, unfortunately, the ability for planners to make community-focused decisions are a touch more limited than I thought. This is reflected by Stephen Rowley in his book, The Victorian Planning System, where he explains that planning controls are not as equipped or suited as we would ideally like them to be in dealing with social problems, especially when unpopular land use proposals meet the requirements of a planning scheme. An example of this that I've witnessed in my placement revolves around the redevelopment of a famous hotel in Mentone, which was redeveloped to accommodate luxury apartments and townhouses, despite the number of quite legitimate objections. However, the redevelopment of this heritage-listed hotel in the end met all the requirements of the Kingston planning scheme and therefore went ahead, with the council seemingly ignoring all of the community's concerns, which prompts the question, to what extent should the regulatory provisions of the Victorian planning system be used to deal with social issues?